In the 1750s, the Indian subcontinent was fracturing. The once unified Mughal Empire was losing its grip, and peripheral provinces were drifting into autonomy. The most prized of these was Bengal. European merchants called it the Paradise of Nations, an economic powerhouse built on massive agricultural surpluses and a booming textile industry that supplied the entire globe with fine silks and muslins. The British East India Company was the primary European entity in this landscape. They operated as a sovereign-like corporation, backed by a royal charter and a private army that maintained its own fortified centers within Bengal's borders. In 1756, a 23-year-old named Siraj ud-Daulah inherited the throne of Bengal. He stepped into a volatile situation, facing immediate internal rebellions from his own family and a restless aristocracy, while having to manage heavily armed foreign corporations. The most pressing issue he faced was an escalating economic dispute. Decades earlier, the Mughal emperor had granted the company trade passes, called dastaks, allowing their official corporate exports to bypass local taxes. But company employees began using these passes to exempt their own private side hustles, effectively laundering the tax liability of the entire regional trade for a fee. This systemic tax evasion meant Bengal's treasury was bleeding revenue, right when the state needed funds to defend against outside invasions. Meanwhile, individual corporate officials amassing personal fortunes were draining the resources needed to maintain the province. The tension spilled over from ledgers to the physical landscape. Anticipating a war with the French, the East India Company began expanding its military fortifications at Fort William in Calcutta. They did this without seeking or receiving the Nawab's permission. Siraj ud-Daulah viewed these illegal walls as a direct challenge to his authority. He issued a strict order to halt construction and demanded the company surrender political fugitives they were sheltering inside the fort. The British leadership in Calcutta flatly refused. The company's defiance forced a confrontation over the basic right to rule. If the British could build military bases and harbor the Nawab's enemies at will, Bengal's sovereignty existed only on paper. Siraj ud-Daulah responded with force. In June 1756, he marched an army of 50,000 men on the British settlements. The defense of Calcutta was poorly organized, and the British governor abandoned the city. By June 20th, the Nawab captured Fort William with minimal resistance. Following the surrender, the remaining British prisoners were locked in a tiny, poorly ventilated guardroom overnight. In the sweltering heat of a Bengal summer, the overcrowded cell became a death trap. By morning, dozens of captives had died from suffocation and dehydration, an event that became known as the Black Hole of Calcutta. Historical records indicate this was the result of chaotic negligence by lower-level guards seeking revenge for the siege, rather than an order from the Nawab, who was unaware of the confinement until the next morning. Modern estimates also show the widely reported fatality numbers were heavily inflated by the survivors. But the East India Company seized on the embellished accounts. They printed and distributed visceral narratives of the tragedy, intentionally stoking public outrage both back in Britain and at their southern military base in Madras. They successfully framed a lethal administrative failure as an act of calculated barbarity. The Black Hole provided the East India Company with a moral crusade to justify deploying a military force to recapture their assets and punish the Nawab. The company dispatched a naval and ground force commanded by Robert Clive. Arriving in Bengal, Clive retook Calcutta. Faced with this military efficiency and the separate threat of an Afghan invasion from the north, Siraj ud-Daulah signed the Treaty of Ali Nagar, restoring all of the company's former trade privileges. Clive immediately marched on the nearby French settlement of Chandernagore and captured it. This strategic strike stripped Siraj ud-Daulah of his only potential ally, equipped with European artillery and modern military training. Knowing his force of 3,000 men couldn't defeat the Nawab's 50,000 in a fair fight, Clive turned to espionage. He found a willing partner in Mir Jafar, the Nawab's commander-in-chief, and the two forged a secret pact to stage a regime change. This coup required massive capital, supplied by the Jagat Seth banking family. As the wealthiest financiers in the world, they funded the conspiracy to protect their domestic wealth from the Nawab's unpredictable policies. When an essential merchant intermediary named Omachund threatened to expose the plot unless he received a massive payout, Clive orchestrated a brazen fraud. He forged a fake agreement on red paper, the Red Treaty, promising the merchant his cut, while keeping the actual, binding White Treaty free of any such promise. With the bribes secure and the intermediary silenced, the East India Company had shifted its strategy. They were no longer just trading, they were actively purchasing the collapse of a sovereign government. The two armies met at the village of Plassey on June 23, 1757. Clive's small force of 3,000 took cover in a mango grove, staring down an army of 50,000 troops and 53 heavy cannons. For hours, the sides exchanged cannon fire in a tense stalemate. Then, at noon, the environment intervened. A sudden, heavy monsoon downpour soaked the battlefield. The British troops were prepared for the weather and quickly threw tarpaulins over their gunpowder. The Nawab's forces lacked this field discipline, and their exposed gunpowder turned into useless sludge. Assuming the British guns were disabled, the Nawab's loyal commander ordered a cavalry charge. As the horsemen approached the grove, the British removed their tarps and unleashed a devastating barrage of dry artillery. As the loyalist lines collapsed under the fire, the Nawab looked to Mir Jafar for support. But Jafar's massive columns of troops stood perfectly still, refusing to engage. Realizing he had been betrayed by his own high command, Siraj ud-Daulah fled the field. Clive's victory was the culmination of a meticulously planned betrayal and superior reign preparation. The fighting was a violent formality for an outcome already bought with Jagat Seth's gold. Mir Jafar was installed as a puppet ruler, effectively handing control of Bengal's treasury to his foreign backers. The East India Company had secured the rights to collect taxes and dictate trade, gaining the power of a sovereign state. This corporate takeover grew from the clash over illegal tax evasion. When the Nawab attempted to enforce his laws, the company used the tragedy of the Black Hole as a convenient tool to launch a war of conquest. Ultimately, pure corporate greed, funded by internal treason, started this war. The East India Company orchestrated the conflict because they realized it was far more profitable to buy a nation than trade with it.